to my channel. My name is Lisa Alistway, and on this channel, you will find a variety of inspirational and informational videos. So if that sounds good to you and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. My guest today is AmarAtma, who is a grief coach with an advanced certification in grief and a grief recovery specialist. He's a board certified chaplain, having worked with hundreds and thousands of grievers in a Trauma One University hospital, specializing in end-of-life palliative, trauma, and critical care. He has a dual master's degree in traditional Chinese medicine and divinity, and uses a trauma-informed mind-body-spirit approach to teaching and helping grievers from the many losses that occur through life. He currently offers one-on-one virtual grief coaching to grievers on how to grieve and how to let go. I will link his Instagram and his webpage in the description box down below for your reference. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So honored to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
So happy to have you. So could you just share maybe a brief background about yourself?
Yes. As you shared in the bio, my educational background is a little unconventional in terms of grief. It was something that found me as opposed to me finding it. It wasn't that I was 12 years old and saying, okay, I'm going to do grief work with people. That makes a lot of sense for my life. But in my young age, I had somehow a relationship to empathy and emotional connection. But as a young man growing up in America, I just didn't have an access to figuring out what to do with all these feelings that I had connecting with people. So it put me into a really, really tough spin, like a dark night of the soul during much of my life. And it kind of drew me towards excavating kind of this human condition around emotions and around grief and understanding loss at varying levels. And then I used my kind of education, my professional development as a way to learn and heal and grow and live what we refer to as that wounded healer's journey, go through that deep level and hopefully be of service to other people from that work.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I know on your Instagram, which is awesome, I highly recommend anybody that's watching this to go check it out. So you work a lot with grief, but you also teach essential life skills. Can you share a little bit about what that is exactly?
Yeah, so I find that grief is an essential life skill, perhaps one of the most important ones, or obviously not the only one. And how to grieve and how to let go. I think that was a really big component that I had never really learned, that if I had learned in my childhood, that it would make a lot of sense for me in terms of helping to heal or helping to cope with really tough and difficult and maybe even dark emotions that we all face in our humanity. It's a kind of a universal response. And so I find that to be an essential life skill to figure out and learn, and not knowing how to do that and knowing that the world is really in a kind of profound state of collective grief and varying levels of grief in many forms, and we're all kind of healing from it, that this is something that's really important for us. But the way we kind of approach that is something that we have to also pay attention to as well. I think that grief hits us at a multidimensional level. It kind of hits our body, mind, and our spirit. And so kind of figuring out the different ways to work with grief kind of requires a kind of multidimensional support as well. And so these are some of these life skills that I think are kind of important. And the ones that I often share on Instagram is a lot of mind-body exercises, a lot of breathing exercises, a lot of movement-based techniques. I have training in yoga and in Chinese medical Qigong. And I utilize a lot of these mindfulness, movement, breath work, breath rhythm, exercises to help create an energetic flow that helps us alleviate some of the pressure and tension that we carry in our body around some of our unresolved emotional pain. And being trauma informed myself from my years of working in chaplaincy and end-of-life care, I'm finding that safety is an important part of this, but also getting to a state of physiological relaxation to help us heal at some of these deeper emotional levels. And I think that many of us are carrying a lot of weight emotionally and not knowing what to do with it. We have all the insights. We know what we need to do. We know what's the problem, but how do we get ourselves out of there? How do we shift the needle slightly for ourselves. And so social media becomes a really unique platform to share short clips, short videos of how-tos around some of these essential life skills. And these are some of the main ones that I teach.
Fantastic. So let's talk about unprocessed grief. You just touched on it, how it's, it's a collective worldwide pandemic, epidemic problem. We see unprocessed grief in our family systems. We see it in the workplace. We see it in the community. We see it in politics, business. It's everywhere. People walking around with a lot of grief that they deny, they suppress, and it comes out in disease and all kinds of ways. So what can we do with all of this unprocessed grief? And how can we maybe make it better at a societal level and at an individual level?
I think that the formula for me is something that I've kind of distilled over many years, and just trying to figure out what's the simplest way that creates the highest impact for us. And just kind of being a student of unresolved pain and emotions and grief for the better part of 20 years, I find it that face, embrace, release. That's the simplest way that I can really lean into it. And what I mean by that is, how is it that we come out of emotion phobia? That's the big part of it. And that's really coined by Miriam Greenspan from her book, Healing Through Dark Emotions. And I love her work. And I love this concept. And I had to learn this deeply for myself in chaplaincy, because when I was working end of life care in the hospital and inpatient, I realized that we all have similar human conditions that we're going to face. Grief and loss is a universal experience. Mm-hmm. Every human being and other species will experience loss, and thus the grief that will come from it as well. And so how do we do that? Well, the thing is that grief is very much an emotional response and not an intellectual one. And I think that we get stuck really trying to rationalize, analyze, interpret, apply logic to something that is a purely emotional experience. And because we haven't really learned about emotional resiliency or emotional intelligence, or to learn how emotions can be abundant for us, how we can be an emotional health and emotional richness and emotional prosperity. We haven't really understood the spectrum of emotions. So thus we judge emotions, right? We say, oh, well, good emotions and bad emotions, and dark emotions and light emotions, and negative and positive. And we have this labeling about what we want and what we don't want. And I learned that when we start to face and embrace some of the heavier or dark emotions and lean into them, to what Viktor Frankl in that Man's Search for Meaning book, talking about as a foundation of post-traumatic growth, as paradoxical intent, a lean in style to some of the heavier, the dark, even though that's very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. That's the way that we can start to alleviate this pressure that we are carrying for ourselves. And so I tested it out over and over and over and over again with grievers that I was facing and people who are facing end-of-life care. And they really taught me. And they really gave me the courage to kind of do it for myself as well. As I learned that I can't be in the dark spaces of other people's lives unless I'm comfortable in the dark space of my own life, I started to really not bypass or transcend or compartmentalize my pain. I faced it. I was like, what is really going on here? I have a phobia around emotions. I don't want them. I got a fear around this. How do I lean into it? And when I started to lean into the dark, I couldn't believe it. The light was extraordinary. And not only was it extraordinary, there was resilience and there was depth and there was capacity, that which I was seeking for so long in terms of feelings of joy and aliveness started to really come into fruition. And I learned how exhausted I was from really compartmentalizing and tucking under the rug all the stuff that I have really had of unresolved pain. And so that work of end-of-life care really was a foundation, a formation for me to seeing that over and over again, this power of the human spirit, that when we lean in, face what's really going on, embrace it as something that's totally right, not wrong, and let go of some of that resistance and some of that phobia, the release comes, and that release really brings about what I think people are looking for. And so this is kind of a humanity thing that's happening. I've worked with a lot of people internationally, and I'm finding that, not only is this a human universal response, it really transcends culture as well. And it's really kind of powerful to see that. So this is something simplified that I've come to really learn and understand and grow into. and then serve others with.
That's awesome. So when you say like lean into it, you mean obviously, you've got to acknowledge it and you've got to like feel it. And that's where I think people get stuck. They don't
Yeah,
want to feel it. They want
that's
to
right.
drink. They want to eat. They want to, addictions, and they just want to escape those feelings. But you're saying if you can power through those feelings and get to the other side, it can be more beautiful.
Yeah, I would might shift a little bit of the language, but you're totally right in terms of concept. In the grief recovery method, I really love this concept that they have called STERBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. So it's an acronym there, STERBS, short-term energy relieving behaviors. Now we have short-term ones and we have long-term ones. Now the foundation of a lot of our emotional resiliency is foundation about how we learned about emotions growing up. We were taught around compartmentalizing our feelings. We were taught that certain emotions were allowed to be expressed and others were not allowed. We were taught not to cry, or that for men especially, crying was weak or it's fragile, or that when women tap into their emotions, they're utilizing it as a form of manipulation, or that they're overly emotional.
Or they're
And so,
hysterical
or hysterical,
yeah.
exactly. And so we have these thoughts, these teachings we have around emotions that really create a construct. And so when we say lean in, some ways we have to unlearn what we've learned around emotions and recognize and normalize that. To normalize grief, we got to normalize some of the emotions and recognize them as a strength, not a handicap or a liability for us. So initial phases of work that I do with people is actually just on emotional resiliency 101. How to feel, how to lean in, how to embrace emotions. What do they really feel like? And how do we get out of our judgment and shame and guilt around feeling emotions? How do we develop emotional honesty? How do we allow ourselves that authentic expression that's there? Now, I tell you, judgment and shame are true barriers to people feeling emotions. And the journey that I take people on is an 18-inch journey from the head, our intellect, our rationalizing, our analyzing, all the way into our heart. And recognize that some of the boundaries and barriers that we're coming into are intellectualizing concepts around judgment and shame. Oh, I'm not good enough. That means if I'm feeling this, that means there's something wrong with me. Or, I feel this, that means that, I'm not a good person, or I'm weak, or I'm fragile, or something is horribly deficient about my personality and my being. It's like, no, not at all. There's something totally right about that. We've never given ourselves permission to really express that.
I've also seen where people are uncomfortable with your feelings, and so they'll stifle you for their own discomfort. And so, I mean, there's a whole societal programming that's, not been very healthy. And I think that's why we see generational trauma that gets passed down, people having kids when they haven't resolved their trauma, and then they give their trauma to their kids.
That's right. There's a lot of components of epigenetics, I think, that comes into play with that. And I think a lot of components around belief systems and ways we've been taught and parented, and ways that our parents have been taught and parented as well. And recognizing that this emotions as a liability is something that's generations old. And we're at a particular time now, in a pivot of our culture and our society, post-pandemic, mental health becoming more normalized, that this is a really important time for us, in people who are really looking into it. And in some ways, people who are forced to face it are really being more resourced. And so I think that's where this social media is becoming very helpful. I can't tell you how many people reach out to me on a regular basis, sharing about how really simple 30-second reels are really making an impact in their life because they're teachable, or how so much of what they have on their social media is really mental health focused, from professionals sharing just tidbits and posts and concepts, so that we can really have an access in small dosing ways. Like, oh, insight. Oh, good insight. Okay, this is how to do this. Oh, okay, this is how to feel. Oh, okay, like I'm looking to go to food or alcohol or sex or social media, or I'm going to binge watching TV as ways to buffer or mask my pain. Oh no, what if I spent 30 seconds and kind of lean into that feeling there, rather than that knee-jerk reaction, to just knowing that it's not going to take my pain away. It's just going to mask it for a short period of time. And that there's actually a lot of relief and release that comes from doing that.
So when you say lean into it, I know you utilize like body movement exercises. Can you touch on that and how they're helpful?
Absolutely. sometimes I think that for many of us, especially because grief and trauma are kind of they're interwoven within each other. It's hard to sort of decipher between grief and trauma in certain ways, but the trauma-informed world is so robust and remarkable, with a lot of theorists and researchers coming out giving us a lot of vernacular and education around what's really going on with us and what we're really experiencing at a physiological level. When we talk about the vagus nerve or the polyvagal theory or somatic experience from Peter Levine's work, or aspects of how the body keeps a score from Bessel van der Kolk's work. Some of this stuff is really quite profound around how our physiology and our neuroendocrine functions are really operating around how we're experiencing trauma, and then areas about where we get stuck. And so mind-body exercises like yoga or qigong, or some of the breathing exercises through mindfulness, are really helpful to get that ventral vagal state, to get to that relaxation response, to get to from that sympathetic drive of mobilization to much more of a parasympathetic space, to helping us come into that place of relief. I've known that unless I can create a space of safety for another, we're not going to be able to have a sort of a relationship therapeutically to help with the healing process. And so in some ways, co-regulation is an important part of my work. But self-regulation, I think, is an even deeper part of the work that we're needing right now, is for people to have resources on a regular basis that they can do daily, multiple times a day. Like I really incorporate to be able to get myself a feeling of safe within my body, and not only then safety, but also a sense of relaxation, which Andrew Huberman at Stanford is really talking about non-sleep deep relaxation as an important part of rejuvenation, and seeing so much more of the science that meditation at a deep level can have multiple times more effective rejuvenation and sense of readiness than sleep itself. And so a lot of the science is coming out right now around optimal health, that some of these mind-body exercises, when incorporated with rhythm, movement, and breath, can actually create this huge component of relief, that you don't have to do it all through the mind or all through the emotions. We can do it through somatically through the body, and it's sometimes a little easier and in some ways a little bit more effective, but a foundation to the practice that I incorporate for sure in my work.
Yes. We all know that like exercise releases endorphins and we feel good. And it makes me think about like your extreme sportsmen that, want to like climb Mount Everest or whatever. I mean, like, I imagine they have a lot of grief. Is that maybe a good conclusion, that they're going to such levels to try to process and get it out?
I don't know about that actually. Can we?
It's a hypothesis.
What I think I hear you saying, which is interesting, is anybody who's experiencing some forms of extreme in their life, whether they are extreme sports or extreme workaholics, or even in the fine dining world, sort of a Michelin star level work that people might be activating themselves, or any levels of where they're really at the tip top excellence at a world-class level. Can we say that that behavior is driven from unresolved grief? I don't know about that. I think that there's so many more components. We couldn't say yes or no to that. But I can say that unresolved grief truly drives a lot of our behavior in our life, and we're often unaware around that happening. So in certain ways, when somebody climbs Everest, or they receive their Michelin star, or they receive their Emmy Award or Academy Award, or they receive the highest accolade within their field, and yet they're still feeling unfulfilled in their life. They're still feeling something's not quite right, even though they've achieved at that level. They've been recognized by their field. They've got all the publications, all the PhDs, all the credentials, and yet still something there. Then we might say, there's something unresolved here. We might need to figure out what's going on, because these accolades that you've driven your life towards might be driven from something unresolved inside that we might want to speak to, or kind of help face, embrace, release into.
Okay, very cool. So you mentioned dark night of the soul. Can you basically define what that is? And is it possible to have, a dark weeks, dark months, a dark year, and it's not just one night?
That's right. Yeah. The dark night of the soul is not really a single event night that it happens. That's kind of a misnomer to it. But Thomas Merton has a really great book called The Dark Night of the Soul. And Thomas More, excuse me. Thomas More has a great book on the dark night of the soul, which he really extrapolates on this concept. But it's a real profound, I might say, a body, mind, and spirit experience, which leads us towards a place of asking existential oriented questions around purpose and meaning of our life.
Mhm.
It's a form of a spiritual pain that questions our existence in the sense of wanting to understand who we are and our role or our existence in this larger place of this life. Who were we before this life? What does our life truly mean through this aging process at this time that we're living in? And who are we after maybe we pass away? And what meaning do we have at this sort of larger level? And in some ways, it becomes sometimes a loss of faith or a crisis of faith experience for people when they enter into a dark night of the soul. There's a real religious or spiritual component to that. And so there's a lot to be said around the dark night of the soul, but you're right, it's not a mere night that it exists. It can extend it for years and years at a time.
Mhm.
And I've experienced two really formidable dark nights of the soul through my life. And I've been with people through their dark nights of the soul as well. So I've experienced it as a supportive person, and I've experienced it for myself. Um, and 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 have really, and I'll say it this way, while it is the dark night of the soul and it is remarkably profound, it is also one of the things that I truly think is the gift of our life. It's an awakening experience. It's a way in which we get through disillusionment and we come through insights of awareness that are kind of beyond a complacency or a comfortability of thought towards an activation or a rebirthing experience that happens. And so I speak to it this way because many grievers, their loss that they've experienced is a life-changing event that leads them through a dark night of the soul. And we don't quite have a template or a curriculum about how to do this. And so by naming it as a major loss that we've gone through, dark nights of the soul is a grieving process, then we can start to have some vernacular and vocabulary and relationship to what it is we're going through, and thus also how to get out of it in a way that's not destructive, but something that is an awakening experience of growth.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like it can be like a true wake-up call if you have been kind of blind to certain situations,
Sure.
or you're not, or you're not being your authentic self. I mean,
Totally.
it catches up with you and you're like, I gotta wake up.
Yeah, it's true. And so unfortunately for some, it's not necessarily a choice that they make it. They're almost forced into the situations.
Mm.
It's not something that it's like, oh, I just feel like life is not really fulfilling that for me, and I'm just, I got the cars, I got the TV, I got the house, I got all the things. It's like, this is not that great. I'm gonna find something else.
Mhm.
Dark nights of the soul are often a forced into situation. It is something that is changed, and we are moved from where we're at to
Mm.
another reality, and it's a threshold we cross, and it's like a very much cocoon to butterfly reality. But what we often forget to talk about in the butterfly transformation is that when that caterpillar goes into the cocoon, it melts, it becomes dissolved, it becomes
Mm.
absolute nothing
Mm.
before it turns into, well, I won't say nothing, but it's not just caterpillar turns into a butterfly, but this this melting process, this transformation that goes through it. And that is remarkably challenging in our time because we, like I said, don't have real rites of passage or transformation rituals or ceremonies that help people lead through this.
Mhm.
And these are some of the cultural elements we have in our country in America right now that are, I think, seemingly remarkably difficult, because I think there's a lot of people experiencing an elongated process of a dark night of the soul, which they are doing their best to cope with.
Mhm.
Um, and but yet is somewhat devastating.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are suffering, and some of it too is not having like the best access to the best therapist or healthcare workers that can help
Sure.
them. Like if you can only see somebody for 1 hour once a week, okay, there's a lot of more hours in the week, so a lot of times people leave, unsatisfied with how our mental health is actually treated.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think mental health is going through quite a transformation within their field as well. When so much I think that mental health practitioners have been in a form of education for many, many years of teaching about the benefits of mental health. Right now, there's a lot of funding that's going into mental health and been so normalized during the pandemic that people are really, really remarkably challenged. You can see some of these athletes as well, like a Naomi Osaka and even Serena Williams, people in the upper echelons of their work and their life talking about mental health and taking breaks. We saw Simone Biles in the Olympics having to take a break as well. And so this normalization around this conversation has come up really big. And so I think mental health is like what I think surgery was, maybe 50 years ago, in the sense of it being general surgery into subspecialties of surgery. Now we have mental health that's going into subspecialties of mental health, and what's your specific role and what are the skills that you have, and more research has gone into it, more funding has gone into it. And this is why I also like coaching as well, because I think that I appreciate the once a week, 1 hour, not to be enough. So how do we resource people? How do we teach and educate? How do we provide prompts and exercises to do in between the week so that there's not a reliability or a codependent relationship with our therapist for the next few years, but something that is like a beginning, middle, and an end of a journey that says, hey, you're good, graduated, you're doing well, you're experiencing that aliveness from your grief process. And when I went into coaching, that was my mindset as well. I thought about therapy, I thought about wanting to do license-based work, but I just found it that for me, already having run a private practice for several years and developing a relationship through acupuncture and Chinese medicine, that I really wanted to resource people. I wanted them not to have a reliability on me, but to utilize a professional service and recognize that that's the case, but also have a way in which this is not an indefinite relationship. We're going to have a place where you're going to graduate from this and you're going to feel extraordinary because you're going to face loss in other aspects of your life. It's just a guarantee of being human. So we want to be resourced for you to be able to handle that and do that well. And of course, I'll be here if you need some more support, no doubt about it. But we don't necessarily need to do 2 years of work around a loss, because you're going to be okay with the process. You're going to feel equipped now to be able to handle something that might be changing for you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your background. It's very diverse, and you kind of bring in some Eastern principles and the Western model. And I think it appeals to maybe somebody more holistically when you can approach it that way versus just in the textbook, this is what you have, and this is the pill we're going to give you or whatever.
I think humans are so much more dynamic than that, and I think that one of the areas where we have difficulty is pigeonholing people into a reality that they are. Now, not to any means incorporate medicine in terms of its diagnostic model. I think that when we talk about grief, we have to take it out of the concept of mental illness and talk about it in terms of an emotional injury. Not everybody in the world is going to have general anxiety disorder diagnosable. Not everybody in the world is going to have major depressive disorder or personality disorders or have something that's going to be diagnosed through the DSM categorization. But every human being is going to face loss. That is a universal experience in one way or another. And so that is a part of our human condition, but we're not really supported in something that's so universal. So we have a universal experience and response without really universal solutions. And when I decided that I want to do grief coaching for people, I had to really take a look at it and say, hey, can I actually do this for people? Can I actually make a difference in their lives? And then I was like, yeah, I think so. But it's like, is this what's needed? Now, with my background, as you mentioned, and level of diversity, I had a lot of different avenues of my life that I could have really gone into specialize in. I really, really had a lot of avenues. I could have chosen one of 20 different avenues of life that I could have gone into. But I focused on grief because my Chinese medical training taught me to see the constellation through the randomness of the stars. I can see multiple areas of what people seems as unrelated symptoms having one core component to it, a root cause that's leading to this variability of life. So when we talk about somatic or chronic pain issues or digestive difficulties that people have but not having a lot of recourse for it, or we're talking about mental fog, a lack of clarity, or feeling emotionally stuck in certain areas, or feeling spiritually disconnected, I can kind of lean into my education and my diverse background to say, oh, I think we have a root cause to some of this. And I kept coming back to, it's grief. Oh, it's unresolved grief. Oh, it's grief. when I watch
All roads
movies,
lead to grief.
it's like all roads are leading to grief. And I'm watching movies, and my wife is so frustrated with me. She's like, it's about grief, right? I'm like, it's about grief. Every movie we're watching the Avengers, it's about grief. You're watching these superhero things, and it's like, oh, it's always about grief. I watched Top Gun Maverick recently, and I was just like, oh my God, it's about grief. Goose died. He's having difficulty in healing with that, and has this powerful moment with Val Kilmer, and saying, I don't know how to let go. And it's like, it's about grief. It always is.
Yeah. And so that brings me to my next question, because I know you work with end of life individuals, and obviously that is a really raw, vulnerable time in people's lives. Can you touch on a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah. So my grief journey began before I did end of life care, but it really became crystallized during this work. And I got into chaplaincy in about 2014, and I went through the residency program and did a long fellowship in terms of training and education around end of life care. It's very powerful. And, holding the hand of somebody who's dying in the hospital is a powerful experience. Hearing about their regrets and disappointments around their life and sharing with them their wisdom about how to live, and being a young person listening to that was very formidable. I was very much changed by this experience. Being around death in varying ways, death by trauma, like car accidents and gunshot wounds and assaults, to cancer, and to adults and to children. I've seen the good die. I've seen the bad die. I've seen Black, white, Hispanic, Sikh, Asian, Muslim, Christian, atheist. I've been through all of the different variations of death experiences, people of faith, people not of faith, and watched varying many levels of death experiences, from critical care to palliative care and hospice level care, and adult and pediatrics. It's very powerful. It's a life-changing experience. I think death education is something I think is really important right now in our world, because I think that not having a relationship to our impermanence is also part of the demise of our humanity right now. I think that if more people had a relationship to their impermanence, life would be very, very different for many people. And in some ways, some of our medical procedures and our advanced care capacity has taken us away from death happening at home, where we see this dying and aging or death process. And I think that for a young person, seeing that and being removed from that is actually a teaching that is an unintended consequence of our advanced care services in our ICUs. And I had an opportunity for many, many years to work at that inpatient level to see that and be changed by it.
Wow. If it's so beneficial, but yet we suppress it, deny, that's our own grief being played out, obviously.
Correct. That's exactly right. There's two different types of death or grief that I really saw in the hospital. Those who are prepared for it and those who are not. And you can definitely tell that the latter was so much more formidable for people. Their loss was powerful. It was intense, and it was powerful. I remember sitting with a man. His mom was dying. His mom was about 94 years old, and she must have weighed maybe about 94 pounds. And she talked about how she wanted to die. And he left the room. This is before she was in critical care. He left the room when he was having this conversation. He couldn't hear it. He didn't want to hear it. And I totally honor and respect that. But now she's in the scenario, and he's the medical power of attorney to make now decisions on her behalf, because she's in a scenario where she's intubated in the ICU on machines, keeping her alive. And he has a very difficult time being in a scenario of letting her go. His grief of losing his mom was getting in the way of her having a sort of natural death. She's lived a long time, but that experience of it was very powerful. So I sat and had a conversation, because the nurses asked me to sit with him, and had changed her code status, we call it, from DNR, do not resuscitate, to full code, which means full resuscitations. And that means chest compressions and all the drips that go into keeping the heart going. And she was already in a resuscitating fashion. And we call this a chemical code, where she's on medication, keeping her heart pumping, because it's if she were to be taken off the machines, her heart would stop naturally. And he's sitting there having this difficulty, and the doctors are having a difficult time connecting with him, and the nurses were having a difficult time connecting. I went and I sat with him and I talked to him about half hour, 45 minutes. And what I come to learn is that he was very much grieving her death well before she's in the situation. And he couldn't really lean into it. He couldn't really be present to his feelings. And so over the span of about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, I sat with him and I let him share. I gave him permission. I asked questions, open-ended questions, to give him a space for his grief to come out. And he cried. And we cried together. And I sat with him at bedside. And he came to the conclusion himself that this was not what she would have wanted. And soon, within the next couple of hours, let her die peacefully when all the family had arrived and all the peace had been there. And that was very powerful experience about that grief experience. He did not want to let her go, not because he didn't want to let her go. He was not ready to face his grief, and he was having difficulty within that experience. Such a big deal. But the people who, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I can keep talking. I'm sorry.
Well, just that process of letting go, part of it's, you don't want to let go because that's like the finality of it all. And you know that the grief doesn't just stop that day of letting go. It's a process of letting go for months and weeks and years, maybe even after. Or, there's people, that haven't let go of things for decades.
It's interesting, right? Because we don't really know how to let go, and we haven't really been taught how to do it. And interestingly, one of the foundations to letting go and releasing emotional pain is space to being emotionally honest. It's so simple, actually. As soon as he was given an opportunity, and I saw this over and over again, I knew that for certain families, and for many of my families that I worked with at the hospital, especially in chaplaincy, I didn't have this continued care with them for a long period of time. So I knew what was my role at that critical time in their life in regards to their grief. And if I allowed them to have emotional honesty, which meant that I gave them a space of safety to being vulnerable and allow them to just be themselves without any judgment or shame, their grief trajectory was going to be totally different than others. And many people reached back out to me and shared with me. I can't tell you how many people, I worked in it long enough that I had reoccurrences of relationships with people, and was very powerful to be able to have that feedback years and years later around a moment of time of creating a space for people to express and to release. That it kind of shifted it for them. So we think about grief being this many years and life-changing, no doubt about it, but this unresolved piece there. And I don't know. I think that we have a very passive relationship to grief. We think that time heals the wound, but I think that there's an active way we can do grief. And when we can be active in it, it doesn't need to debilitate us. It can be life-changing, but not in the dark, heavy gloom experience that we have thought it to be. It can actually be a life-changing, like this post-traumatic growth, this relationship of something of resiliency that I didn't know inside me comes out, where we make that foundation or charitable cause or do something extraordinary with it, or something in which we become more kinder and gentler and compassionate within our spirit. And I have seen it time and time again. We can be active in our work, and it can be extraordinary.
Yeah. I know, losing a parent or losing a child is probably, the most profound loss we'll ever experience in life. And I think that people have to, take that, like you said, even though it's a horrible thing, they have to experience, their experience is they're not alone in that experience, and that they can have that compassion towards others who are going through it. And maybe that's the meaning behind all of this grief and loss.
I think that this is Viktor Frankl's work as well, is that for each of us, we have to apply our own meaning to it about what this might mean for us. And that's a journey in and of itself as well. I'm not a total fan of the stages of grief, because I think they're misattributed to all grievers when they were mostly intended to be for those in death and dying situation, from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in some ways, knowing that meaning is now that new sixth stage of grief, is to develop what that relationship, to have that post-traumatic growth quality. I think that development for people is very individual and unique to themselves. You see, we're not all going to grieve the same, because every relationship that we have to what we lose is going to be different. If we had twins, identical twins, two boys, and they lost their father, they're not going to grieve the same because they each have an individual relationship to that parent who had died. And we have to appreciate that individuality in that relationship. So to grieve is to have loved, and how we have loved, the level at which we loved, and how we particularly love is going to tell us a story about our grief. And it becomes grieving becomes a self-actualization process. We learn deeply about ourselves, but really about how we love and the depth and capacity to which we love. And that is extraordinary to me, because that totally reframes the whole conversation around grief towards something around love and beauty and poetry and about our beingness. And that growth in there and that aliveness that comes from there is exquisite. And from that journey of that unfolding, of connecting to the soulful nature of our emotional heart, can really provide us profound depth of meaning. But the tricky thing is, meaning can be a trap for many people. Because we intellectualize so much, we can get stuck. It's like an eddy. If you have water flowing, it can kind of pool and go into this little cul-de-sac and kind of get stuck thinking that we've done the work. But meaning too soon, or without leaning into this place within our heart to allow the self-evident truth of insight and awareness and beauty that comes from meaning, then it could be something that we get stuck in our mind. And we think that that's our process. We got to progress through. We got to get to acceptance. We got to get to meaning. Okay, how do I create that? So I've seen a lot of people, and I worked in the organ transplant world for a while as well, where we had people who were making that generous decision around their loved one giving the gift of life-saving organ and tissue donation. And I saw a lot in that world where people started to apply meaning very quickly. And it kind of it helps us feel better. And I don't disregard that, but it's a feeling better with a crux. It helps us for just a bit of time, but it kind of bypasses this whole bevy of feelings. And so to get to a place of, I guess, true meaning, I don't know if we can call it that, requires some of that inner depth, labyrinth, dark work to really come through some of those emotions, that face embrace to get to that release. And release means a lot. That release means aliveness. That release means joy. That release means authentic expression. That release also means a new form of meaning and energy that comes into life. There's a lot that comes in with that release, but you can't get it without facing and embracing first.
Yeah, because when you're grieving, you do feel dead. I mean, it has like a dead-like weight feeling on your soul, your body. And so I love your work because you want to bring people out of that. You, like you said, you want to get them back into the joy and the energy and the positivity in their body.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. It's not actually grief work. It's joy work. It's peace of mind work. It's relief work. But grief is something we got to name, because grief is really the problem. And really, it's our lack of education and resources about how to grieve that's truly the problem. The way we have normalized grief in our world is often very incorrect. Not only does it not help, it actually is detrimental for many people. When we say time heals all wounds, or just to stay busy, or some of these religious sort of elements that comes in that, this will only make you stronger, or God will give you more than you can handle. These things are
nice bumper stickers.
But they're devastating for us when we're grievers and feeling that. It makes us feel so alone and lonely. That creates then the existential pain, the dark night of the soul, that I truly feel alone in this universe of 7 billion people on this planet. It's powerful. So we got to normalize grief. We got to normalize emotions. We got to talk about it, what it really is, and make a difference in people's lives. Because you know what? We can do this. And it's actually simpler than most people think. And my job is to help educate about how simple we can make it.
Well, we definitely need more AmarAtmas in this world. So we're getting here toward the end of our conversation. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
Wow. I'm just going to take a deep breath here for a moment. I just really appreciate this moment with you. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share about this information. I think that we can do this. we're at a particular time in our humanity, kind of a pivot time. And I would say even a rite of passage. We have rites of passage for us individually, but I think humanity right now is going through a profound rites of passage. And if a large number of us can go through the threshold of inner work, inner transformation, inner depth, and come to the other side with light and joy and peace and authenticity, we can shift the planet. We can shift it. My motto is world peace through inner peace. And we're needing this dimensionality of work to exist. I believe that unresolved emotional pain and grief can make the most educated highly unintelligent. And we have a lot of people with a lot of pain that are making big decisions at a global geopolitical level. Mm-hmm. And I feel that if we can get some people to do that depth of work at that collective grief level, we can shift the needle to really creating a foundation of peace that we can ride and having a life that we have all dreamed of living rather than this dystopian reality. And so for me, the level of grief work is at a major level. And that's how I attribute meaning to my life. I'm here for a purpose, and this is my purpose to do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on my channel today. This was very informational and inspirational.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, so much.
Yes, yes. And if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to comment and subscribe and hit the bell to be alerted to when the next video drops. Thanks for watching.